tout le monde. Urban student, editor-in-chief, and publisher, Global Brief Magazine Institute for 21st Century Questions. This is our star-studded closing panel. It's a short and sweet one because it's been a very long 2 days. We've literally covered all parts of the world and have had up to 60 panelists from all cultures in a few languages. And we're really delighted that people from around the world are joining us, but even more grateful for our wonderful panelists who have taken time out from their Saturday evening or late Saturday night or Sunday morning in some parts of the world. Bonjour, Hubert Védrine. So let me quickly introduce people who need little introduction. Jean Charest, of course, is a colleague, former Premier of Quebec and former Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, joins us from Montreal. Hubert Védrine, ancien ministre d'Affaires étrangères de la France. Bonjour depuis Paris. Bonjour Hubert. Hans Corell, former Undersecretary General for Legal Affairs and Legal Counsel of the United Nations, I think in Stockholm. Richard Gowan, UN Director, International Crisis Group. Hi, Richard, in New York City. And also in New York City, I suspect my friend John MacArthur, newly appointed Director for Center for Sustainable Development at Brookings in the United States, but a Canadian always. So I'm going to actually start with our friend Hubert Védrine en français, and this is a prerogative I'm going to take because Hubert wants to do it in the better language. So Hubert, vous allez nous parler en français de l'avenir des institutions globales, and then everyone else will address in English. So Hubert, je passe la parole à vous-même.
Bon, merci de votre invitation. Vous m'entendez bien?
Oui.
D'accord. Merci de votre invitation. Je suis content de participer à cet échange nocturne, pour moi, avec des participants de grande qualité. Et je salue en particulier le Premier ministre chrétien et je suis content de parler avec les autres. Alors, je dirais tout de suite que, en fait, dans l'histoire vraie du multilatéralisme, ça a fonctionné quand des puissances dominantes, animées par un esprit intelligent de coopération, ont imposé le système multilatéral. Puisqu'en réalité, on a tous en tête les institutions qui ont été mises en place sous le leadership américain après 1945. Ce sont des institutions multilatérales qui ont été mises en place de façon unilatérale au début. C'est un paradoxe. Évidemment, tout le monde y a trouvé son compte parce que c'était bien conçu, c'était intelligent et il y avait beaucoup de résultats positifs à attendre de cette coopération internationale. Mais nous sommes longtemps après et on peut faire remarquer que d'abord le multilatéralisme, c'est pas une religion, c'est une méthode. Normalement, c'est une meilleure méthode pour atteindre les objectifs que l'unilatéralisme, surtout quand il est brutal. Bon. Donc, il ne faut pas en parler comme s'il y avait eu le bien et le mal. On est un peu entre les deux, d'autant que les puissances dominantes n'ont jamais été complètement multilatéralistes. Elles ont toujours réservé des décisions dans des domaines vitaux, mais il y a aussi une grosse part pour la coopération internationale. Donc, ce n'est pas parce que l'administration Trump, le président Trump lui-même a donné une image, disons, caricaturale, exagérée de l'unilatéralisme, que le multilatéralisme que nous allons retrouver, la coopération, va régler tous nos problèmes de façon magique. Donc j'invite à avoir une approche précise, concrète, pragmatique du système multilatéral et donc de la coopération. Et naturellement, il ne faudra pas faire la même analyse, on ne va pas faire les mêmes projections ni les mêmes scénarios selon qu'on parle du retour des États-Unis dans les accords de Paris et au-delà, parce qu'il faut aller beaucoup plus loin, du déblocage de l'Organisation mondiale du commerce et notamment de l'organe de règlement du différend, très important, mais est-ce que ça va permettre de renégocier de grands accords? Je ne crois pas. Il y aura plutôt des grands accords régionaux comme celui qui vient d'être signé en Asie-Pacifique, parce que la Chine et le Japon se sont mis d'accord. Le retour des États-Unis dans l'Organisation mondiale de la santé, c'est très important, parce qu'il y a la pandémie et les virologues nous disent qu'il y en aura d'autres dans l'avenir, donc il faut organiser beaucoup mieux. Et la question de l'Iran, c'est encore un autre sujet. Alors, a priori, les Européens, compte tenu du processus d'intégration depuis maintenant plusieurs décennies, sont spontanément portés à préférer la coopération internationale, mais tout le monde ici, dans les participants, c'est bien que les Européens eux-mêmes, au sein de l'Union, ont parfois beaucoup de mal à se mettre d'accord sur leur position, sur leurs priorités, etc. Donc bien, c'est très préférable, bien sûr, il faut aller dans ce sens, mais nous allons presque devoir renégocier parce qu'il n'y a pas de doute sur l'administration Biden, évidemment pas sur le Canada, il n'y a pas de doute en tout cas en principe sur l'Union européenne, mais il y a une grande interrogation sur la Chine maintenant. Pour la Chine, c'était facile de se présenter comme le héros du multilatéralisme, paradoxalement, pendant l'administration Trump. Maintenant, bon, ça va être différent. Que veulent-ils vraiment? Et je pense qu'il y a deux tentations en Chine, soit simplement d'exercer le leadership de la Chine à travers les institutions multilatérales, ou alors de revenir réellement à une pratique de coopération, disons, win-win. Bon, c'est pas évident et je pense que la position chinoise n'est pas forcément écrite à l'avance et qu'elle va dépendre largement de ce qu'elle va trouver en face d'elle. Est-ce que c'est uniquement une politique d'endingment par rapport à la Chine, un peu dur, ou est-ce qu'il y aura des espaces de coopération possibles? Donc, il y a tout un phénomène d'interaction généralisée. Donc voilà, je suis très heureux que nous ayons à parler de la rénovation des institutions internationales et globales, mais j'incite à ne pas l'aborder de façon binaire ni trop schématique.
Merci Hubert de cette première intervention. J'arrive à Monsieur Charest tantôt, mais très rapidement, Hubert, vous avez soulevé le bras de fer entre Pékin et Washington, mais j'irai au-delà de ce bras de fer parce que paraît-il que Biden met davantage d'accent sur Moscou. Comment vous voyez le règlement des comptes entre Washington et Moscou par le biais d'institutions internationales rénovées?
Écoutez, moi je pense, évidemment, je parle prudemment parce qu'il y a beaucoup de gens experts là, hein. Je pense que Donald Trump a quand même fait voler en éclats le consensus américain d'avant, hein, qui remontait à Deng Xiaoping, et Kissinger et Nixon. Je pense que l'idée d'endiguer la Chine est quand même très forte, quelle que soit l'administration à Washington. Je pense que les Américains, quel que soit leur parti, ne peuvent pas accepter l'idée que la Chine, un jour, soit numéro un. Donc, je serais étonné qu'il y ait un vrai changement sur le fond, un changement énorme dans le ton, dans le style, dans les méthodes, etc. Bon, c'est déjà très important, mais à mon avis, ça va rester numéro un. C'était d'ailleurs déjà le cas avec Obama, qui avait conçu la stratégie, le pivot vers l'Asie, avec le grand accord commercial que Trump avait eu totalement tort de casser, même de son point de vue, etc. etc. Alors, sur Moscou, moi je pense que comme les démocrates, excusez-moi d'être un peu polémique, cher Irvine, comme je pense que les démocrates n'arrivaient pas à admettre l'idée monstrueuse que les Américains aient pu élire librement Donald Trump, ils ont bâti une gigantesque interprétation comme quoi c'était dû aux manœuvres russes. Je ne suis pas naïf, c'est évident qu'il y a des manœuvres russes tout le temps. Mais dire que le résultat des élections dans le premier pays du monde pouvait dépendre des manœuvres d'internautes russes ou de services spécialisés là-dedans, c'était extravagant comme interprétation. C'est évidemment faux. Et ça donnait une image de faiblesse, à mon avis, tout à fait inexacte, mais qui oblige les démocrates, dans un premier temps, je pense, à être plus durs encore avec la Russie dans l'administration Biden pour dire Trump, c'est horrible, il avait des relations douteuses avec la Russie, il était complaisant, il disait du bien des dictateurs, tout un discours un peu moraliste, vous voyez, par rapport à ça. Mais je pense qu'au bout d'un moment, l'administration Biden va retrouver l'obligation, en fait, la nécessité de parler avec la Russie, d'abord pour éviter que la Russie ne se rapproche trop de la Chine, et tout simplement pour retrouver des accords de sécurité, des accords de désarmement, des accords stratégiques, ne serait-ce que la question du New START qu'il va falloir proroger. Mais il y aura un mélange des deux. Et il y aura une tonalité, un discours très dur par rapport à Moscou, mais quand même la nécessité de négocier. Mais quand ça reviendra, je ne pense pas qu'on retrouvera tout de suite la grande capacité qu'avaient les États-Unis de négocier, même pendant la guerre froide, quand l'Union soviétique était beaucoup plus dangereuse que la Russie d'aujourd'hui. À l'époque, on ne se demandait pas si on pouvait parler ou non avec des gens qui ne partageaient pas nos valeurs. La question ne se posait pas. Il y avait une obligation réaliste de conclure des accords. Donc, je pense qu'il va y avoir peut-être des tensions, des divergences au sein de l'administration Trump, mais qui retrouveront le chemin de la discussion avec Moscou, en tout cas sur les affaires de maîtrise des armements. Mais ça ne fera pas passer, à mon avis, hein, ça ne fera pas passer cette question devant le défi chinois. Donc, je crois que le défi restera numéro un. Voilà.
Merci Hubert. Jean Charest, huge experience both at the national and provincial level across North America, in the North, in Africa more recently, in Asia, of course in Europe on the Canada-EU trade agreement. What is your sense post-pandemic and coming out of the American election results, Jean, of possibilities for renovation as Hubert Védrine speaks of it, or reinvention or invention of international organizations and institutions and things that organize us?
Well, thank you first, Irvin, for inviting me and on such a distinguished panel. Je veux d'abord saluer Monsieur le ministre Védrine, qui est très connu à la fois au Québec et au Canada. C'est un honneur de pouvoir participer à ce panel avec vous. And I do want to recognize Mr. Carell and MacArthur and Gowan and point out that there's at least 2 Canadians, 3 with yourself on this panel, Irvin, which is always a good sign. And let me start by a general comment about Canada to keep in mind in regards to our basic core interest. We are a trading nation, very dependent on the United States for trade, but one of the countries that depends the most on trade to be able to earn its way. And not only do we depend on our southern neighbor, but we've also had to learn through the years to manage a relationship with a superpower. So it's not just a neighbor, it's a superpower. And taking into account that superpowers behave a certain way. They have impulses. And we're seeing that, and this brings me to a second point, as Hubert Védrine has pointed out, the emergence of a young superpower in its own environment, culture, but nonetheless with the behaviors of a superpower, which means, for example, to simplify it, the reflex of just moving obstacles aside when they're in front of them. And so in real time, in our generation, we are seeing the emergence of this new superpower and something that the Americans have called great power competition. Is this the return to great power competition between these 2 countries? And now in the backdrop of all of this is Europe, is the rest of Asia, is the Middle East and Russia and the rest, and Africa and the rest of the world. And so we're all having to try to determine where this is going to lead us. I'm worried about Canada. One thing that Canada learned through the process of the Trump election, a few things, there's a number of them, but one of them is the Americans cannot and will not be the reliable partner that they were in the past for Canada. It was always taken for granted that the United States would have our back. That's not true anymore. And as we look to the future, I think the assumption is that will not be true in the future, which for Canada is an extremely important change in our view of how we see the world. The second thing is the fact that it's become unreliable, that we don't quite understand what's happening in the United States, by the way. I'd like to know if anyone can really figure it out. None of us are, we follow politics, but Trump was a surprise. This election campaign in the United States may have been a personal defeat for him, but his agenda, in good part, was validated. And on certain issues, there will be consensus, on others not. But on foreign policy, one of the questions in the world, Urban, for Europe, for other countries, is this a temporary change in the United States, or are we going to revert back to Trumpism in 4 years from now? And so Europe talks about strategic autonomy, and they should, as they look to the future, because the United States is changing. On China, I agree with Hubert Védrine. There's a broad consensus in the United States on how to deal with China. The tone and the approach will be different, which everyone welcomes. And I think what we'll see Biden do, which is a welcome change, is coalition building, which Canada will be happy to be part of. Now, part of the story today also has to do with the Great Recession. with increases in inequality, with the fact that a lot of people have been left behind. And this caught up to us before COVID, when there was even a big debate launched on the future of capitalism. And you'll remember the Business Roundtable put out a new statement of what the responsibility of the corporation was towards their shareholders, but not only shareholders, stakeholders and communities, and even their country. And followed by Larry Fink of BlackRock, and followed by the World Economic Forum. And then COVID happens. And that has amplified a certain number of trends. It has shed a light on some of the fault lines in our society. And one of them is how we cooperate in the future. And one of the questions that emerges is the future of globalization. Again, for a country like Canada, that's, existential. And we depend on outside markets. Supply chains are going to change, but I'm not sure they're going to change as much as we think. Efficiency will be trumped by resiliency in supply chain. So it'll be geographic proximity. It'll be things like that will now counter redundancy. So it'll be a different world. And the question is it going to be a reset or a relapse? And I'm more on the side of reset, and I'll just close with one sense of where we're going. I think countries like Canada are going to be working very hard, as we already do in a group called the Ottawa Group on multilateralism and trade. And that's where Canada will want to be. And that's where we hope to find partners like Europe, where we hope to find partners in the ASEAN area, for example, countries like Singapore, who can be partners and guide us through this, and countries in Africa and elsewhere. One word about Canada, Russia, the Arctic, a critical issue for Canada that is not understood in our country. Russia is also a neighbor of Canada, and it's an issue, Irvin, that you've examined and looked at very well. We are much more engaged in this debate and the stakes in regards to the future of Russia than Canadians think. And we will play. We have decisions to make in regards to the sovereignty of our own northern territory in that respect. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean. And the Arctic was raised in earnest earlier today in a great panel. So thanks for that second intervention. I want to turn to our friend in New York, John MacArthur. John, you have prolifically worked on and written about the Sustainable Development Goals, and tell us a little bit about what a sustainable world looks like, between quotation marks, post-pandemic, and given the changing alignment in powers and the changing government in Washington.
Well, thank you so much, Irvin, and ça me fait tellement plaisir d'être avec tout le monde ici. C'est un panel extraordinaire. Alors, merci, grand merci à tous. I would just start by saying, first, Brookings is based in Washington, so we're a little bit up close to a lot of these transitions right now. And it's quite interesting, I think, the shift that is under debate right now. And the fellow panelists have just described, I think, a lot of the tensions that are under discussion. At the core, and I'm sure Richard and Hans have their own views on this too, but there's a bit of a debate right now on what it means for a new administration to come in, whether it is a return or a reset, or I would argue a great transition. And so, because the new administration is coming to terms with, and many of my colleagues would argue, will be needing to come to terms with the fact that there is a fundamentally different tectonic power structure, if you will, globally today. And there's a fundamentally different set of interests to be managed and issues to be managed. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we have within the United States, in the rural areas, challenges around the basics of economic prosperity and the ability to improve livelihoods, while life expectancies are in many cases declining, just as much as we have challenges of tackling on global prosperity. At the same time, we have, for the first time in history, entered a global majority middle-class world. We're adding another couple billion people of the global middle class within just around 15 years. Most of those new middle-class consumers are around Asia. They're a massive economic power. They're also an environmental force. They're a political power. And our institutions aren't built globally to deal with that set of pressures in terms of whose interests are going to be heard. And they're also, of course, where a lot of our own companies are trying to expand their own markets. So the Canadians are trying to get in there around Asia to be able to sell their goods. Americans and of course the rest of the world too, Europe included. And so I think the big shift is ultimately one of the battle between power and cooperation. And I would argue we've seen a lot of emphasis on power in the past few years, and there's a bit of a renaissance at play, perhaps around cooperation as a basic premise. But the cooperation has to be towards an end. And I would argue a lot of our multilateral system got a little bit stuck in cooperation for the sake of cooperation. And I would argue that our Canadian debates on a rules-based international system, for example, got a little bit stuck in the rules as opposed to the outcomes that the rules are meant to support. And so I think we're going to see the organizations that are delivering outcomes are doing quite well. A quiet success of the past several months is Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations. They exceeded their initial pledge targets in their recent replenishment, with the United States and Congress backing as strongly as anywhere in the world, because this is a major outcome-oriented institution for the world, similar with the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, Malaria. These have much more innovative, multi-party governance structures. They have evidence-based review. Do the medicines get where they need to get or not? That's a basic premise that guides them. But I think we'll be seeing their true test this year on these premises in the place that is the great hope, as hard as it is for multilateral cooperation, and that's the climate negotiations. So it might turn out to be an accident of history that the COP process for climate, the Paris +5 major check-in, was meant to be in the fall of this year, but because of COVID got pushed to next year. In the UK, which is hosting this is top political agenda, even for the Conservative Party, thanks to the legacy of David Cameron and his colleagues in the Conservative leadership. And we're going to see this as one area where, with the Biden administration placing such emphasis on climate, and the Chinese government placing such emphasis on this, and those private sector leaders all placing such emphasis on this for their own self-interest, I think this is where we're going to see the true test of where cooperation might have to link to outcomes in a new way. And that is going to be the fundamental economic question of our time.
Thanks, John. Hans Corell in Stockholm. I bring you conspicuous greetings from my colleague Sasan Shomenesh, who knows you well in The Hague, co-founder of the Institute. Hans, John was talking about institutions that are goal-oriented, and you worked at the UN, which is certainly, at least in part, means-oriented, but with some major achievements. What's the future of the UN as the central international institution coming out of the pandemic, and given the new power alignment in the world?
I think the UN is absolutely necessary. Absolutely necessary. And commissions that examined this issue in the past have come to the same conclusion. But the main thing is that the organs of the United Nations function. And the United Nations is not only the UN and the 6 organs, it's the United Nations system. And that system is governed by the board, a special board, which is chaired by the Secretary General. And they assembled 31 organizations around the UN itself. But for me, my main focus have been on the Security Council, because that is the most powerful organ of the United Nations. But in some cases, it's actually its weakest organ. And I can tell you that I met with Donald Trump together with Kofi Annan when Donald came to offer his services when we had to repair the Secretariat building. And I never forget how this man behaved when the 3 of us sitting in Kofi Annan's office in the UN building. And I've been very sad these past 4 years, but I hope that things will change now. But I'm concerned about the Security Council, and I published an article last year when I gave the title Security Council Reform. The Council must lead by example. And in this article, I focus on the role of democracy and the rule of law. And all panels that I have listened to in your meetings here, those words have been mentioned. And I think it's so important that we can really realize that this is what we have to build the organization on. And in this article that I published, it's available on website. It's just to Google my name and you will find it. Security Council reform. The Council must lead by example. The focus is on conflict prevention. And the Council is behaving in a manner that they do not effectively prevent conflicts. And Kofi Annan and I, we had, after he left the UN, we had worked for Kenya for several years to assist them after the presidential election in 2007. And then he got this mission in Syria. And he said, Hans, can I work in Syria as I worked in Kenya? And then he fell silent and shook his head and said, no, I can't. I do not have the support of the Security Council that is a precondition for me to succeed. And I'm going to leave the office, which he did in August 2012. But in this article, I'm focusing on several issues on the world population. We were 2 billion people when the UN was founded in 45. We are getting close to 8. We might be even 9 billion in 30 years. This will be a tremendous threat to peace and security if we combine that with the climate change. And in the last panel, they spoke about the Sahel region. It's not only sea level rising, it is also desertification. And the big areas in that region will be so arid that people cannot live of what they grow on the ground today. I also mentioned the Paris Agreement, of course, and the polar regions. I've been very much focused on the polar regions, the opposites, south and north, but also the opposite, north, a sea surrounded by continents, and the south, a continent surrounded by sea. But they are the same size, 14 million square kilometers. That's about 1.5 times the size of the United States of America. So these are enormous areas that we are now, shall we say, must focus on. And I know that both in Russia and Canada, you are looking at the release of the methane. And I'm sitting in a group where we are discussing these issues also. But also I'm looking at the responsibility to protect and empowerment of women, a very important element for the future in the reforms. And then the lack of progress in the nuclear disarmament. And I've actually suggested in this article that maybe they should ask for a second opinion by the International Court of Justice, because I do not see that one could use nuclear arms without violating international humanitarian law. You cannot make a difference between combatants and civilian populations. So these are some elements. I would also like to mention to you that I was asked to give advice to the Interaction Council of Former Heads of State and Government, which is an organization which is managed by Tom Axworthy, your countryman. And in 2008, I was asked to give advice on the rule of law. And when I was sitting there talking about the rule of law, Helmut Schmidt, 90 years old from Germany, asked, I wonder if politicians understand their responsibility for the rule of law. And I said to myself, there are books written about this, but they don't have time to read thick books. So why don't we elaborate a guide for politicians on the rule of law? And this we did, the Wallenberg Institute in Sweden and the Sister Institute in the Netherlands. And I would therefore like to show, if you can see it here on the screen, rule of law, a guide for politicians. If you Google those words, rule of law, a guide for politicians, you will immediately find this guide. And it doesn't cost anything. That was the idea from the beginning. And it is now translated into 26 languages. And all the translators have done the work for free because they thought it was so important. So if I may just draw your attention to this and then should say, close in on what I mean by UN reform here, that the politicians must understand their responsibility for the rule of law. They have to bow to the law, and in particular to a law that was elaborated in 1945 by a generation that had experienced 2 world wars. We should pay respect to them and show respect for the UN Charter and try to, shall we say, make the organization functions as it should. And I think that President Biden, when he takes office, he will try to do this, but we must all contribute here. And also, finally, I would like to quote the third lines from the third preamble paragraph in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because there was a discussion about China in the beginning of these meetings here. This provision reads, whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellions against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. And this is why Goal 16 in the Sustainable Development Goals is so important. And this provision in the declaration in the commission chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the most active participants in drafting of these 3 lines was the Chinese delegate, P.C. Chung, I'm told. So the Development Goal 16, with its targets, rule of law and anti-corruption, if that goal is not, shall we say, achieved, it will be very difficult to achieve all the other goals among the SDGs. So this would be my message here, and I hope that President Biden might change the US behavior in the UN and support it as it should.
Thank you, Hans. We will certainly return before long, at least one more go through everyone and some closing remarks. But I want to sharpen the focus, chers collègues, to say that the thematic of the conference over the 2 days is twofold. First of all, there's been a huge global pandemic. And secondly, we have a change in power in the first or second most important country in the world. So it's clearly changing parameters. The UN, as Hans was eloquently explaining, was created after the end of a strategic epoch, the end of a global war. If the pandemic is the biggest calamity since that end of war, clearly there'll be some monumental changes in international organizations. So we can sharpen the focus to say, well, there's been a pandemic, ergo there must be some sort of change in our thinking. To give the sharpest example, granular one that Jean, you'll appreciate here in Canada, in my calculation, quietly, there are at least 100, maybe 200,000 Canadian kids in one of the most advanced countries in the world out of effective schooling. They're neither in physical school nor in virtual school. They are nowhere. They have very dark futures. This repeats itself several fold in the United States and India, but in East Asia, we're fine. In most of Europe, we're fine. But so that requires a different calibration, because on top of the climate change you're talking about, you were talking about the Sahel, there will be a whole generation of displaced young people, including in wealthy countries. So this leads to all sorts of outcomes that would not have been anticipated by the pre-pandemic international order. And this is a segue to our friend Richard Gowan in New York City. Richard, what are some of the conflict or the tectonic plates in international affairs about which we ought to worry in the coming post-pandemic order? And what are some of the instruments we can use in international organization, either fixed or flexible, to prevent the worst?
Well, thank you, Irvin. It's a pleasure to join this panel at the end of the conference. Jean said it was always good to have at least 3 Canadians on a panel. I have the misfortune of not being Canadian, but I have the fortune of being married to a Canadian. I married into the city of Hamilton. So I'm always delighted to join panels north of the border. Also, I would say, as we have been talking about China, any discussion of China for me does come back to my colleague, Michael Kovrig, one of the 2 Michaels being held now for almost 2 years by Beijing without any justice at all. And for anyone working with me in Crisis Group, as a purely humanitarian issue, we cannot think about relations with Beijing without thinking about Michael. But having said that, I would actually respond to you on a slightly positive note, Irvin, because I think that it's very easy to talk about the weaknesses of multilateralism, and it's very easy to talk about the need for UN reform. But looking back over the last 4 years, I actually see two positive stories. The first positive story is that everyone told us that Trump would destroy the international system, and he didn't. Trump took a series of quite nasty kicks at the Paris climate deal, at the Iran nuclear deal, and most recently and most personally at the WHO. But what we saw was that most countries didn't follow him, and actually most countries actively rejected these efforts by the US to unpick the global order. And I think that's actually a source of comfort because it's shown there is some resilience in the international system, which we often say is very fragile. And on the second note, and pointing in the same direction, I would say I take comfort from the COVID experience. If we'd been having this conversation in March, we would all have been talking about the EU splintering in front of COVID, the lack of international cooperation around the pandemic. You know, in the first quarter of this year, it really seemed that international cooperation was falling apart in the face of the disease. 6, 7, 8 months on, it looks a bit better. We did go through a very rough patch in the first quarter of the year, but especially with the Biden administration coming in, I think we can assume that over the next few months, we will see a further tightening of international cooperation around vaccines and other responses to the long-term effects of the disease. And countries such as Canada have actually been quite central to keeping multilateral cooperation alive. So I feel actually unusually positive about the state of the international system after the Trump shock and after the COVID shock. However, I hear absolutely your note of doubt and your note of concern about what happens next, because I think the worst of the COVID aftershocks may yet be to come. We are likely to see the economic damage caused by the pandemic translate into more social crises, and some of those social crises will turn into violence globally. And I don't think that the bits of the UN system we need to respond to those crises are fit for purpose right now. I certainly don't think that the Security Council, which took 3 months to approve a pretty bland resolution calling for peace in the age of COVID, is ready for a new wave of crises, riots, and sort of state failures, if that's what we're facing. I don't think the human rights system, which has been severely curtailed in part by differences between China and the West, is ready for what's coming. And I defer to John and others, but I'm not really sure that we have an economic toolbox to provide stability to countries that are going to be facing huge budget pressures and huge social pressures in the year ahead. So while I would give the multilateral system a pass grade, actually a pretty pass grade, a pretty good pass grade for surviving Trump and COVID, I do worry that we're about to see some of the weaknesses that Hans talked about, the weakness around security, the weakness around human rights, and the weakness around the rule of law come into focus in a very troubling way if COVID does lead to further global instability.
Thank you, Richard, and we'll return to Hamilton and your connection there at the end, for better or worse. Hubert, à Paris, vous avez évoqué dans votre dernier livre qui a été publié au sein de la pandémie même, l'idée, si j'ai pas tort, d'une écologisation, je crois, de l'ordre international, si je n'ai pas tort. Vous entendez quoi par cela?
Oh, c'est très simple. Comme je pense que maintenant, le monde entier, avec des nuances, bien sûr des différences, a pris conscience du fait que les menaces écologiques étaient sérieuses, très graves. Pas pour sauver la planète, pour sauver la vie sur la planète. La prise de conscience n'est pas la même en Europe, aux États-Unis, au Canada, en Chine, mais quand même, ça va s'imposer partout. Donc, moi, je passe les étapes intermédiaires pour ne pas être trop long. J'arrive à la conclusion que l'humanité doit s'engager dans un programme d'écologisation systématique. Et on comprend très bien quand on pense à industrie, c'est un domaine en soi, industrialisation. Et ça s'entend bien en français et en anglais. C'est un processus. Donc, il n'y a pas le bien et le mal. Il n'y a pas d'un côté les écologistes qui sont le parti du bien et tous les autres producteurs, etc., qui sont le parti du mal. C'est une question d'adaptation. Donc, on va, de même qu'on a industrialisé le monde à partir de la Grande-Bretagne et des autres au 18e et 19e, on va devoir tout écologiser. Évidemment, le problème ne se présente pas du tout de la même façon pour écologiser l'industrie, ce qui a démarré à peu près partout d'ailleurs, y compris la chimie, mais aussi l'agriculture, mais aussi les transports. Là aussi, c'est très différent. La voiture électrique avance à une vitesse folle par rapport à ce qu'on pensait. Pour l'avion, c'est plus compliqué. Après, il y a la question de l'énergie. Moi, je suis français, donc je pense qu'il faut assumer le nucléaire tant qu'on n'a pas trouvé de solution formidable de remplacement. Les énergies renouvelables ne sont pas au point. Quand l'Allemagne est sortie trop tôt de l'énergie nucléaire, elle a relancé le charbon. Donc, ça montre qu'il y a un problème de rythme mal maîtrisé. Et on sortira du nucléaire quand on aura trouvé les batteries de l'avenir permettant de garder l'énergie pendant 1 an, ou quand on aura maîtrisé la fusion, quand on aura maîtrisé l'hydrogène, etc. Donc, ce n'est pas la même chose. Écologiser l'agriculture, c'est très compliqué. Parce qu'évidemment, il faut manger moins de viande, évidemment, il faut arrêter d'abattre les forêts, naturellement. Mais on ne peut pas mettre en chômage des centaines de millions de gens dans le monde du jour au lendemain. Donc, c'est une question de rythme. Et quand on raisonne en termes de rythme, on s'aperçoit, qu'il y a déjà des dizaines de millions dans le monde de chercheurs, d'inventeurs, de dirigeants d'entreprises ou de patrons de services financiers, de fonds d'investissement qui sont engagés dans cette mutation du système productif. Donc, on ne part pas de zéro. Ça a déjà commencé. Et si on raisonne comme je le propose, ce n'est pas un affrontement manichéen insoluble. On le voit notamment en Europe plus que dans d'autres pays où les écologistes ont des positions maximalistes en général, inapplicables du jour au lendemain. Donc ça ne fonctionne pas. Donc voilà pourquoi je pense que c'est une affaire qui va dominer les prochaines décennies. Ce n'est pas tout à fait trop tard, mais il faut vraiment accélérer le rythme. Et à mon avis, même les pays les plus hostiles, qui ne veulent rien entendre de tout ça, et même les pays émergents qui disent nous on a besoin de se développer, c'est tout. Tout ça, c'est des inventions d'occidentaux pour nous empêcher de nous développer. Eh bien, regardez l'évolution de la Chine entre la conférence de Rio en 1994, où la Chine dit ça n'existe pas, la conférence de Copenhague, où elle reconnaît que ces problèmes existent, mais c'est de la faute des Occidentaux, donc c'est eux qui doivent payer. Et puis l'évolution plus récente avec l'accord de Paris et toutes sortes d'autres phénomènes. Donc je pense que ça peut aller vite dans des pays comme ça. Évidemment, je sais bien que le monde ne va pas aborder ça au même rythme. Donc, je crois qu'il faut s'insérer dans ce processus et que les entreprises qui ne s'inséreront pas là-dedans seront marginalisées. Celles qui vont le faire trop vite risquent d'être en faillite, parce qu'évidemment, elles auront des coûts qui ne sont pas les mêmes que les autres. C'est pour ça que je plaide également pour qu'on invente un calcul économique, un PIB plus intelligent, le PIB écologique, et qu'on ramène dans le calcul économique, donc le calcul de la valeur, tous les coûts écologiques qui ont été externalisés, le but étant que chaque décision prise à chaque minute par des milliards de gens soit guidée par une indication de la valeur qui ne soit pas uniquement fondée sur le profit à court terme, mais qui intègre cette dimension. Je ne dis pas qu'il faut intégrer le bonheur et les questions sociales, c'est trop compliqué, mais intégrer cette dimension. On aurait un guide différent. Voilà, donc pour moi, ça va être le cadre. Et donc la différence très simple, c'est écologie, c'est un terme statique, écologisation, c'est un terme dynamique et c'est un programme.
Hubert, au nom de toute l'équipe, je vous salue sur la publication de ce livre qui a été écrit avec une vitesse, il faut le concéder, éclair. Donc, le recommande à tout le
Et
monde, à notre auditoire.
malheureusement, ce n'est pas encore traduit en anglais.
On y travaille, on y travaille. Jean Charest à Montréal. Over the course of the 2 days, and if I calculate even apart from the 2 days, there's a ledger of conflicts around the world, pre-pandemic and now post-pandemic or inter-pandemic. There have been several conflicts that have erupted around the world, and obviously we have a post-pandemic order to be defined, not planned, but there have to be solutions defined. Where is Canada in terms of leading the charge in not just floating the algorithms for the conflict solutions or these new orders, but actually banging heads, bringing people together, creating the roundtable? There's not a single roundtable apart from the Ottawa group that you're talking about where Canada leads. If I count this half dozen conflicts in the Middle East, the several conflicts on the former Soviet space, the multiple conflicts in the African space, the question, it's almost never asked in Canada, but from the outside, they say, well, Canada has all these capacities. If we only had a mental map that was outside of our continental space, we could do some damage. But there are very few such achievements in modern Canadian history outside of Pearson, some Axworthy, le frère du Tom Axworthy. So your thoughts?
Well, first, let me start by saying that I think I agree with what Hubert Védrine said about nuclear. And you know, the International Energy Agency recently published a report where essentially they say we cannot have zero net emissions in 2050 without nuclear. And so I'm also, I'm not sure that's what Minister Védrine was saying, but I'm certainly one who believes that nuclear is part of the solution. Now, in regards to Canada's leadership, it's a very interesting question, especially coming off, Irvin, as you will know, a campaign by the Trudeau government so that Canada could be a member of one of the rotating members of the UN Security Council, a failed campaign. And there were a few reasons for that. Canada came late to the campaign relative to Norway and Ireland. But there's also things about Canada that we learned. Our branding's very strong. I mean, it's not the issue. But Canada has been missing in action in a lot of parts of the world. Africa, the Middle East, I would say ASEAN. We're so sucked into the relationship with the United States as though we've had difficulty walking and chewing gum at the same time to simplify it. And you're right. I mean, Canada's leadership on certain issues could be very well build a bridge between Europe and North America. And so the Ottawa Group on Trade is a very strong initiative. It does not include the United States and China by design, so that we could have countries who want to focus on how we can make the WTO work better, more efficiently. Canada on climate used to lead. Hubert Védrine talked about the Rio summit in '92, and I led Canada's delegation at that summit. We were the first country to sign the Climate Change Convention. And certainly on climate, on the use of economic instruments, for example, we could very well be part of that. But we could also be a much more active partner in both the Middle East and Africa in regards to the use of soft power, if we chose to do so. And there's a lot of countries who would like to work with us on these issues, if only to advance a certain number of ideas that are core ideas. That again, and I want to return to this because in the end, you know, we're going to be living in a world with two major superpowers who are going to be confronting themselves on some issues and having to work together on others. Globalization is not dead, far from it. Whether it's the vaccine and the pandemic that demonstrates that to us, how much we need each other and need to cooperate together, or whether it's climate change. Now, is there anyone who actually thinks for a second that we can deal with climate change without Russia and China and India, by the way? That's the other country, the other great continent in itself, being part of it. I mean, the answer is obvious, of course. They need to be part of it. They need to be engaged. But we need to create the conditions that will allow them to participate. And Canada is among the middle powers in the world who modestly can do that if it chooses to do so. And if it stops just being obsessed with its relationship with the United States and chooses to be, I think, conduct a stronger foreign sovereign policy that would be that would allow us to have a stronger voice in forms where there is appetite to hear a country like Canada.
Merci, Jean. John in Washington, D.C. And as you look at what's happening from what's coming down the pipe with the Biden administration, what should the engagement be with China, with Beijing, from the American front to advance some of the goals that interest you on sustainability?
Well, I would just go back to Richard's point on the economic stresses of this. And I would also maybe even question the premise of your provocation, Irvin, around
Sure.
what's going to come out of this. We saw after the financial crisis of 08, 09, a lot of hope for international institutional updating, really not too much. I don't know if this pandemic is really teeing up a major institutional renovation right now. I would argue it's not. I do think that the deep, again, tectonic movements of where the world's going will ultimately require the political institutions to be overhauled. I don't know anyone who thinks that in a world of 2050, where India is likely to be, where Brazil is likely to be, they're all going to be happy with the UK and France deciding issues of war and peace on their behalf. That just doesn't really match where those mega trends are running. So at some point, there's going to be a need to shift and a need to update some of these basic, call it ultimate power management questions. But in the meantime, I think we have to understand there's so many dimensions to international cooperation. There's so many layers. I call it the matrix of multilateralism. There's, on every side, there's the corporate, there's the scientific. One of the great, arguably the best part of international cooperation right now is science. We have extraordinary cooperation at the institutional level, at the body, national institutes of health, national research bodies, and so forth. This is unprecedented in many ways, and we will all get the benefit for it. We are not seeing so much on the economic side right now. We're seeing the G20 a little bit, I wouldn't want to say take a limp at a time, but take a very small step at a time moving forward. We just saw a little more last week. But I would argue that just like there's a strong thesis that the crisis of 2008 was really born in the crisis of 1997-98, and how the world responded to the Asia crisis made a huge difference in how it was leading up to 08. There's a lot of strong argumentation that the political shock waves of 2016 in much of the world were really teed up in 2008. And so I think we have to be thinking right now, the shock waves that are not just for next year, but they're for many years to come, based on how people feel this deal gets played out. And so we are not seeing a systematic attempt to make sure, it's actually not even the low income countries, it's the middle income countries that are getting stuck in the middle right now, because they're not poor enough to get the emergency relief, but they're not rich enough to get the finance. And we have $12 trillion of government response right now going around the world, but that's really in the richest countries and a teeny bit in the poorest countries. And then the middle income countries, which are a huge swath of humanity, are really stuck. And so this is where we will see potential for shockwaves, in addition to all those shockwaves you were describing in our own societies, even in the most advanced economies. And this is where a colleague of mine pointed out, and I think it's exactly right. COVID prompted the change in thinking that the Sustainable Development Goals were trying to prompt 5 years ago to begin with, that these issues are all interconnected. A little microscopic imbalance between humanity and nature in one part of the world can overturn economies and societies in all parts of the world. And we're seeing, and I would argue that there are so many people who are tired of being left behind that we need to be thinking much more differently. And I actually have turned off the phrase Great Reset, because it makes it feel like you can press a button. And some colleagues and I were actually going to put out a report this week calling Great Transition. And there's got to be transitions for justice for all. There's got to be transitions around managing nature. There's got to be transitions around managing technology. And there's got to be transitions for generations, for the generational gap that is at risk right now. And we have to be putting in the work on each of these for many, many years in order to avoid these shock waves, while we're also honoring, I would say, the tectonic movements that are likely to keep going.
Thank you very much, John. Although we didn't get to China, so I'm gonna get back to that. So really, really grateful for that intervention. Hans, a question from our audience, I think actually from somewhere in the States, a listener, Hans Corell in Stockholm, about the future of the International Criminal Court. Post sanctions, what's the picture like under a Biden administration, Hans Corell?
Well, let's hope that they can deal with it. And it was Kip Hales who put that question. And I think that what the US should do is to follow the example of Australia, because this is what happened, that Australians are suspected of having committed crimes in Afghanistan. And if the US makes a proper investigation of eventual US soldiers having committed crimes there, then the prosecutor of the ICC will be prevented from dealing with it. So this is how it works. But in the more general sense, if I have a comment here, I am looking at conflicts around the world and ask the question, why is there a conflict? And almost every time the answer is the same: no democracy, no rule of law. And what I would like to see now, with all these elements that we have discussed in your fantastic 2 days here, is statesmanship. And this is what I look for also in the Security Council: statesmen and women who can look to the horizon and understand that their responsibility is not only to their own country, but to all humankind, and not only to the present generation, but also to coming generations. And I mean, I've sailed the seas. In 1956, I came as a sailor to Seven Islands in Canada, and I never forget that visit. But I learned then, when you govern around the globe, you go from one point to another, and there is always a central point, namely the center of the globe. The same thing is when you want to do something and you are in one place and want to go to another place, there is a center also here, and that is the rule of law. And this is why I'm focusing so much on the rule of law. And there are 4 simple elements in explaining it. Number 1, democracy, because it's necessary for a second element: proper legislation, including respecting international rules on human rights. And you can have proper legislation only if you have an assembly elected in a democracy. The third element is the institutions to administer this law, including impartial independent courts. And then we come to the fourth, and maybe the most difficult element: the individuals with the knowledge and the integrity who could administer these institutions. This is how I would like to see the basis. And I have enjoyed very much in my different functions as a lawyer working with experts and technicians, because when you do, you work for something positive, and then you use the law to see to it that it fits and that it works and that you can protect it. This is how I would like to focus here and to summarize my contribution here. And thank you for the
Hans.
invitation.
Thank you. We're going to go 5 minutes over and give everyone 1 minute closing remark. And the remark will be in 2 parts, please. And please stay disciplined in this respect. We used it for every panel. One is, give us a projection 2 to 5 years out in your field or based on your past interventions, where we're going. And secondly, what's to be done? Well, however you conceive of that, very in pithy for leadership. Richard, because Hans was talking about the center of the world, he obviously queued you up in the Hamilton connection. So we'll start with you.
Well, as I understand it, the Ticats will never win the Grey Cup, so I can't say any more about that. Look, I'll just say one thing about leadership and about one leader, which is, I think there is one leader in the international system who gets most of what we're talking about, and that is Antonio Guterres, the current Secretary General of the UN. And the great tragedy of Guterres' time to date is that it coincided with the Trump era, and he's had to play his cards very, very close to his chest. And you know, he's been in survival mode since 2017. And I think we will see a change. And I think we will see a change next year. I think we're going to start hearing Guterres talking about global problems in a way that would resonate with everyone on this panel, and maybe especially what John was saying about the need to sort of rethink and sort of transition towards a fairer global society. And I think he's going to be good at it. He hasn't been the best SG yet, because he's been working with the worst US president. But I do think that Guterres in the Biden era may actually provide some of the leadership that Hans is calling for. And so, yeah, on a night where I'm being 1,000% more positive than I usually am when talking about the UN, I see reasons to be hopeful looking forward.
Thank you so much. Hubert Védrine à Paris. Mot de clôture, Hubert.
Oh, je n'ai pas la prétention de clôturer, c'est très, très, très intéressant. On voit bien que, avant même de rénover le multilatéralisme, ce qui est très ambitieux, hein, on sait bien, par exemple, pour prendre un seul exemple, que la réforme du Conseil de sécurité, ça fait 20 ans, plus de 20 ans qu'on en discute, hein, l'élargissement. Je me rappelle d'innombrables conversations avec Kofi Annan à ce sujet. Bon. Donc, avant même de rénover le multilatéralisme, je pense qu'il faut le remettre en marche. Déjà, le remettre en marche, c'est déjà très important. Donc, redémontrer que la coopération internationale est positive, que c'est efficace, que ça donne des résultats, et que pour les pays qui ne voudront pas jouer le jeu de la coopération internationale, le prix à payer va s'élever. Le prix à payer manque à gagner économique et commercial, et prix à payer politique. Parce qu'il faut faire une sorte de pari sur la compréhension par les opinions. Là, c'est plus compliqué, puisqu'il y a des opinions dans le monde qui se sont senties complètement déstabilisées par une mondialisation peut-être trop brutale, trop débridée. Donc, il faut contenir une sorte de nationalisme défensif qui s'est réexprimé dans pas mal de pays. Donc, il faut que les partisans d'un vrai multilatéralisme, ce que nous sommes tous dans cet échange bien conçu, hein, il faut que les partisans de cette relance comprennent qu'il y a un travail à faire vers les peuples. Et ça ne sert à rien que les élites insultent les peuples en parlant de populisme, parce que ce n'est pas un virus extérieur qui agresse des organismes sains, en fait. Donc le décrochage des classes populaires, puis des classes moyennes, dans la plupart des pays démocratiques, par rapport aux idées de mondialisation ou d'intégration européenne, c'est un vrai problème qu'on ne peut pas traiter par l'invective. Il faut traiter les causes. Il faut calmer les gens, il faut apaiser, il faut convaincre, il faut les récupérer et les ramener justement à la coopération internationale et le faire d'une façon qui ne soit pas vindicative ou arrogante. Donc ça veut dire qu'il faut redémontrer. Et dans le tableau que nous avons fait, à mon avis, le plus urgent, compte tenu du fait que la pandémie n'est pas finie, compte tenu du fait que les virologues nous disent des choses importantes. Les médecins ne sont pas d'accord tout à fait sur la Covid, hein, les épidémiologistes non plus, mais les virologues sont tous d'accord en disant que compte tenu de la population, la surpopulation, le développement, notamment la déforestation, la mise en contact des animaux sauvages et des êtres humains. Donc, ils disent que c'est très probable qu'il y aura d'autres zoonoses, pour prendre le terme technique. Donc, on a vraiment besoin de tirer les leçons dans le monde entier de la façon dont on a géré l'apparition du virus, les confinements, les déconfinements, les reconfinements, les thérapies, le vaccin, etc. Et on a besoin de faire ça pour être prêt une autre fois et pour que l'humanité soit en bien meilleure posture si ça devait recommencer un jour. Bon. Donc, c'est le cadre de l'OMS. On connaît le mécanisme qui avait conduit Trump à sortir. C'est l'idée d'une influence chinoise excessive. Tout à l'heure, on est plusieurs à avoir parlé de la question chinoise. Hein. Donc, le domaine dans lequel on doit faire un deal intelligent qui montre que la coopération internationale peut fonctionner, donner des résultats et que c'est la meilleure des réponses, à mon avis, c'est ce terrain-là. Je ne néglige pas tous les autres, hein, tous les autres, notamment le commerce. Mais là, il y a un domaine sur lequel il faut démontrer que la coopération internationale est complètement, absolument vitale, indispensable. Donc, il faut que l'administration Biden revienne, mais en même temps, il faut qu'il y ait un deal assez franc, peut-être un peu brutal, par rapport à la Chine. Il faut que tous les autres soutiennent cette approche. C'est le domaine numéro un, je ne néglige aucun des autres. Hein. C'est simplement dans l'esprit de suggérer une priorité dans le calendrier multilatéraliste.
Merci Hubert. Jean Charest, mot de clôture.
Well, this pandemic has shed a very intense spotlight on a number of fault lines in our societies. And it includes poverty, women, minorities, the contrast between developing countries and developed. And I think it would be a terrible, terrible waste if coming out of the pandemic, we weren't able to understand that and take a hold of those issues and work at what we need to do. We know, and some of the answers we know well, education, for example, how critically important it is. And to be able to sustain and support people socially when in the labor market and the way work is changing, and climate is the other one that. And so yes, I do see, Irvin, as we come out of this, I think the economic programs to sustain the economy, to stimulate, should be green, and that's what that transition will be about. In the end, though, I hate to be so simple about it, but in the end, it'll be about the relationship between the United States and China, and they have to, and probably do a grand bargain at one point on how they manage that relationship, and all of us are going to be part of that story. And I'm optimistic that the Biden administration is going to be at the table. We talked about 08, 09. The Americans led in the OECD. They led they did not lead under the Trump administration. And that leadership is critically important. Canada will be there, but we can't replace what the big powers will do. And both of them have to come to terms with each other and come to terms with the rest of the world. So we have to help them and guide them, I guess, to get into that direction. So that's where I see it. I'm optimistic. But I'm also a Canadian. Thank you.
See, Jean. John, 1 minute and a half, and then Hans to close us off. 1 minute and a half, please. Demute.
No one can crystal ball this, but I do think that, I have to comment even on the composition of our own panel. We would fail every inclusion and diversity test with utmost respect to everyone on the panel. And I think this is part of what's changing, and it's rightly changing. And we're going to see, and the next time President Biden speaks, probably a female vice president and a female Speaker of the House behind him. I think the movement around gender equality is so far to go and so crucial in its needs. And I think that we will see, hopefully, people I have a lot of time for Antonio Guterres. I have a lot of time also for Amina Mohammed as the Deputy Secretary General, and they're quite a powerful duo. And they've brought gender equity even to the leadership of the multilateral system. And the head of the IMF is now a woman. We have the head of the ECB, a woman. We have a lot of Canada, finally, a female finance minister. We have a lot of these breaks happening finally, but we still have a long ways to go. And I do think we have a ways to go in the inclusion of whose voices count in high-level policy decisions. My view is the ultimate paradox is a lot of people love to celebrate Malala and Greta Thunberg, but then they kind of roll their eyes when it gets to their policy asks. And I think what we need to do is reconcile that their policy asks are actually quite strong. And I would just finish with girls' secondary education is the one thing that even in Canada, all parties of all political stripes think we should be getting behind, but no one's doing it globally. And so this, I hope, can be one of the great breakthroughs of the next 5 years. And I would argue Canada can't, for example, supplant, as Monsieur Charest just said, the US and China, but it can certainly complement, because there are certain things that a G7 country can do with real resources to bring a new breakthrough. Just like we had a breakthrough in global health in the past 20 years, I think we have a breakthrough in supporting young people, especially women, in the next 20 years.
Hans Corell, send us home.
Thank you. I can agree with the previous speakers here when they summarized the meeting. And I would just add that we must learn the lessons from the pandemic. We must learn the lessons from the pandemic as we learned the lessons from the 2 world wars. And also as a European, when I'm critical of the United States of America, I always remind everybody that twice in the last century, it was the Americans who came across the Atlantic to help us out of the mess that we had created, the First and the Second World Wars. But also I'll say education and women, we have stressed it, empowerment of women, and this means that they should be part of the governance of the world. And also, in my view, as a son of a Lutheran pastor, all governance in the future must be secular, because in all countries, we will have all religions, all philosophies, all colors, and all languages. We will be so mixed up, so we can't sort of attach something to one particular religion. So the secular governance should be based on the rule system that we have developed. And I would then close by saying the UN was founded to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And to do this, one has to bow to the law. Thank you.
Un grand merci de la part de toute l'équipe basée partout au monde, mais surtout au siège social à Toronto, à ce panel distingué qui était à la hauteur de la tâche. I want to thank all of the panelists. Indeed, well, John speaks about diversity. We've had 60 panelists from all over the world in all languages, all continents, men and women alike, young and old. Every cut of diversity, I think we've covered it all. So it's time to go to sleep, and we will go to sleep, and you will go to work on the tasks you've set for yourselves and the world at large. It is it's a very, very serious time. I speak from our base in Canada, where I've had to scratch my head to imagine that one of the wealthiest and most stable countries in the world can be so destabilized. And it's much darker in other parts of the world. So I thank you for injecting some optimism and real pragmatism in future scenarios. So off to work we go. You'll find allies in the Institute for 21st Century Questions and intellectual forces through our writings in Global Brief magazines. Thank you for your collegiality and for your frankness, and for the hundreds of people who have joined us from around the world for these busy 2 days. From the entire team, we'll be streaming this online for months to come, and of course on the Twitter sphere in several languages. Thank you, gentlemen. Have a wonderful night. Hubert, bonne nuit.
Thank you, everyone.
Au revoir. Au revoir.
Bye bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.